Well, hey, welcome everybody. David McGlennon here. Welcome to In the Growth. Really grateful that you have chosen to join me here today. We really have an amazing episode today. But before I get into our guest and the topics here today, would you do me one small favor? Would you go out and rate and review the podcast? You know, we want to make a bigger impact. And so we would love to be able to share the impact that this podcast has had on you. If there's something that you've picked up from the podcast, maybe a conversation from one of our guests, maybe it's something that I've shared in a solo episode, we would absolutely be delighted to have you rate the podcast. Hopefully it's a 5-star rating and share just a little bit of a review. That would be just so impactful for us. We would really appreciate it. The other thing you could do too is share it with someone that you feel would be really impacted by this episode. So as you're going along and you're listening to this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would share it with somebody that comes to your mind. I know that I do that all the time, where I'm listening to a podcast or I'm listening to an episode from somebody else's podcast, and I think of somebody and I think, gosh, they would really enjoy hearing this. This is something that they need to hear. I'll share it right then and there. So you can do that right from your podcast app. Now, today's episode is all about leadership. It's really about the power of it, the need for it, and really the impact that it has on an organization. And so I'm really excited to bring this episode to you, especially because it really ties into our current holiday offer of the Emerging Leader Academy and the Emerging Leader Inner Circle. And the offer that we have going right now, especially over this holiday season, is that for a single investment, rather than a per participant investment, you can have all of your emerging leaders participate in our normal Inner Circle group, as well as the brand new Emerging Leader Academy video library of teaching. So if you've ever wanted to be able to teach your emerging leaders the skills that they need as a leader, this is really the solution for you. And we would love to have you be a part of this inaugural Emerging Leader Academy and the next year's Emerging Leader Inner Circle. So if you'd like to learn more, I'd love to have you email me, david@davidmcglennon.com. We'll get a short discovery call set up to make sure that you understand what the commitment is and how it might impact your leaders. All right, so today's guest is someone who I've just recently gotten to know, and I know that you're going to enjoy this conversation. Our guest today is Trish Buzzone. And Trish is a leadership facilitator, and she's somebody who discovered her purpose while she was in another role in another industry, and she made a pivot from that prior industry. This is such a great story. I'm not going to share anything more from that story, but she's helped leaders in a variety of industries. But she specializes in the automotive retail industry, and it's really fascinating. She's a thought leader. She is someone who loves to focus on the strengths of a team. And she also talks a little bit about belonging, which is a huge resonation with me. And because we know each other, we have a robust dialogue around the impact that improving leadership has on an organization's effectiveness. And I just am really excited about this conversation. And what I would invite you to do is, as you're going through this conversation and listening to this conversation with Trish, listen to her stories and pull something out of the story that you can apply to your own life as a leader, or maybe apply to your leadership team. And then when you do that, I would really love it if you would send me a note, email me to let me know what that useful information was. What are your most useful thoughts or ideas from this episode? Shoot me a note, david@davidmcglennon.com, And that would mean the world to me as well, just to hear what you're picking up from this conversation. So let's go ahead and get into this robust conversation around leadership right now with Trish Buzzone. Well, hey, Trish, welcome to In the Growth Space. I am so glad that you're here today and really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. I am as well. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm always curious about people's journey and parts of their journey where they make switches. In recent years, you've probably heard it called a pivot, but switching from one career to another or from one industry to another. And I know that you were in one industry and switched to another. I just kind of love to hear that story because sometimes as leaders, we can really learn a lot from another person's story, especially when we've made a switch or we've made a pivot.
Sure. Well, gosh, I started out in working for a consulting firm. It was a boutique consulting firm out of California. And I live in Idaho. And at the time, I was living in Florida. And it was in the settlement services industry, but this consulting firm had a proprietary sales system, and they brought me in to travel around the country working with their clients to implement this proprietary sales system. And it was really kind of I would say a highly advanced program. And so it was something nobody else had out there and nobody else was doing. And it was a way to help underwriters and title companies separate themselves out of the pack and kind of get out of the pile.
Okay.
And so they brought me in to work with them to go around and teach this proprietary sales system. And while I was doing that and traveling around and loved it, by the way, absolutely loved it.
Sure.
While I was doing that, one of the things that I found out is that I'd go in and I'd meet with the title company owner or the senior players in the underwriter companies. And I discovered that it really wasn't a sales problem that they had. It was a leadership problem.
Interesting.
And I thought it was really interesting because I was having a bit of a hard time getting the salespeople to want to do the ride-alongs, to want to learn a new system, to really want to lean in, which that all kind of speaks to accountability, right?
Right, absolutely.
And so it's like they can hire you and they can bring you in to teach a system and they can hire you to help coach people. But if the senior leadership isn't buying in,
right,
what's got anybody else buying in?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
and so,
I think that you just brought up a point there too that is so important for if we have senior leaders that are listening to this, it's I hate to use this little phrase, but monkey see, monkey do. I mean, it's if I see our senior leadership doing one thing and then telling us to do another thing, that's just not going to work.
No, it really doesn't.
So there has to be some coherence.
And it really isn't that the senior leadership didn't buy in. They bought in enough to hire the consulting company to come in and do the work.
Sure.
They were fully bought in. But what didn't happen is they did not transfer their buy-in to their team. They brought us in and just had us start working with them. Hey, we're going to bring these people in to ride along with you. And, you're going to, learn a lot and grow a lot. But it was more like sometimes, and it wasn't all the time, but sometimes people in the company were feeling like they were getting done to.
Sure,
they didn't have an experience of being included in the decision or being included in, wow, somebody's going to get in my car and they're going to ride to my next sales appointment with me. And then they're going to sit in the conversation that's usually it's a different dynamic when there's two people in a room having a conversation with a prospect than when it's just a one-on-one, right? So there's so many dynamics that I just don't think that some of the leaders, and I'm really cautious about that because some leaders really got it and were really spot on with it. And we still needed to do a little bit of leadership development, but most of the leaders didn't understand how to transfer that emotion of certainty for their buy-in for the program over to their people. And so I say all of that to share that I ended up in this company, in this consulting company, being the second top producer next to the president of the company on getting renewals. And part of why my renewal rate was so high was that once I went in to do the sales system, we do the launch and we do the kickoff, and then a couple of times going in and kind of assessing where everybody was at and kind of getting a pulse of the company, I started to identify where is that leadership, that leader's lid, so to speak, that leadership lid. Where is their limited thinking? Where is their, what have they missed? And I went in and I was able to go in and provide just what I had picked up along the way in my own years of experience. I just started to provide a little bit of leadership growth and leadership dialogue to help those leaders transform where they were thinking from. And so I ended up with a high renewal rate for that, because once you get the leader to buy in to then go talk to the team from a different perspective, then the team says, oh yeah, I want to buy into this. Everybody gets on board and it becomes their choice, not a consultant coming in and telling them what to do, but them saying, we want to learn and grow. Everything shifted.
That makes a big difference. That makes a big difference. Was there I'm kind of curious, was there a theme? Or let me ask this differently. What was the theme or themes that you saw that were their lids, like where they were kind of bumping up against their own, growth barrier, or their own, comfort zone or limitations?
Sure. I think consistently across the board, and I bet you're gonna be like, oh, absolutely. There are, I want to say, 4 key areas where people really kind of hit the lid. And depending on how the culture is in the company that you're going to, I want to say one of these 4 tends to surface to the top, and then the rest of them kind of fall underneath. Sure. And the number 1 is usually communication.
Yeah.
It's just, or a lack of communication, or just the flow of communication. They think they've communicated, but maybe that person didn't pick it up and didn't hear it. Right. So I think communication can sometimes be where that spot is, that lid. I think accountability, as we had just said, I think accountability is a little bit of it. I think sometimes leaders don't realize just how much influence they have, and that the influence is really demonstrated by what they're doing more than what they're saying. Kind of what you were, that monkey see, monkey do, right? Right. And then I think the other area is change. And that I think people really just kind of get resistant to change. And before you can even implement a really good system, you and I both know that if you put a system in place, almost any system will work.
You're right. Yeah.
But you've got to get past the change resistance of putting a new system in place. And so what happens is people think, oh, well, the system doesn't work. And it's like, no, it's because we didn't go in and properly help somebody kind of make that shift and make that move into that change that we're looking for.
Yeah, and that takes that change, and I always talk about embracing change in high performing companies. The leaders embrace change. In other words, they move towards it as opposed to resist it, and that's a different mentality. And even that though takes really some intentional communication. Getting clear on expectations, setting clear expectations, and I think of in my mind, I always think of, I call them fundamentals, but essentially they're behaviors that leaders have to have in order to be able to communicate well, setting expectations, and making sure that all of those get to be communicated to their team. And so I think what you're sharing is not uncommon in a lot of leadership development. So it's interesting that you found that as those themes, those 4 themes. I think it's really interesting.
Right. And you mentioned fundamentals, and I think when we talk about the fundamentals of leadership, I think 2 that really to me are the cream. The ones that really rise to the top are really being really good at listening and really good at asking really well-crafted questions. Don't you think those are kind of fundamental?
100%. Yeah, I talk about listening generously all the time, and that's one of my, if I have to have a favorite, that's one of my favorite fundamentals, is to be able to listen generously and to really understand what's behind the words, what's being said, what's not being said. And so,
Yeah.
I 100% love that. Love that.
Yeah. And so the question that you asked me, this is kind of a long way around the question that you
Yeah.
asked, which is
No,
kind
it's
of
good.
that pivot. But
Yeah.
that's really what, like, while I was in that company, I loved what I was doing. I loved the sales
Mm,
system. I loved the people that I worked with. I loved the
yeah.
clients. I loved the CEO that created the company. I thought it was just
Mm,
amazing.
yeah.
But speaking of making pivots and sometimes where we can get limited, um, the CEO had an excellent business model, a great customer model, a great sales model, but had a very, very poor employee business model.
Oh,
And I
tell me
don't
more
even
about
know if
that.
people really think about an employee business model. I spend a little bit of time talking about that with the
Yeah.
clients that I work with, but
Yeah.
he ran his employee business model in his blind spot.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is that when you have a company and all you have are consultants, that's what makes up your entire company, that are going out
mm,
on your behalf, implementing your proprietary sales system. And I was on the
mm.
road 50 weeks out of the year. And so I had two
Wow.
weeks off. And I would travel Monday through Friday. And I would be in a different city every 2 days. And
Oh
then
my
I'd go home for
goodness.
the weekend and then I'd turn around and go do it again. So my husband started calling me his 2 day wife. And I was
That
kind of
cracks me up.
referring to my life as my 2 day life because
Yeah.
I was literally even only home 2 days on the weekend. And
Wow.
so I really would share with people, yeah, this is my 2 day life. And
Yeah.
there, there were some sacrifices I made in order to make that work. And I don't get me wrong, I truly, truly loved it. And I really, really loved the CEO.
Mm,
But
yeah.
all of us would have a conversation with him when we'd have our opportunity to do our team meetings and we'd say, we're burning out. We need a
Yeah.
little bit of something extra. There's something missing in this business model for your
Yeah.
employees. Something needs to shift. There's too much. There's too much. And he was
Mm-hmm.
one of those guys that because it was his business, he was super passionate about it. And
Sure.
it wouldn't matter if it was 11 o'clock at night or 1 o'clock in the morning. And with all of us in different time zones, he would call because he'd have something on his mind to get
Oh
expressed and
gosh.
communicated.
Sure.
And so it really just felt like I was never
Mm,
off the clock. Now that's on
yeah.
me because I
Yeah.
could have
Sure. Sure.
silenced my phone. There were some
Right.
things that I really truly could have done, but I really
Yeah.
operated inside his business like it was my business. And so I really was
Yeah.
more in the collaborative space of that. But part of what we would say in our team meetings is, look, we're all burning out. And so what was happening is the CEO was on the chopping block for a divorce. And then I saw the president get on the chopping
Oh.
block for a divorce. And then I
Oh.
saw another regional vice president like myself go on the chopping block. And I was like, okay, I am next. And so what would happen for me is I'd go home and on Saturday morning, my husband and I, the first thing we would start to do would be to argue
Oh
because I
gosh.
was
Yeah.
so independent and used to my life on my own. And he was so used to
Right.
having the house to himself. We'd get together and the first 20, 30 minutes of our Saturday morning when you're normally sitting in front of a fireplace, sipping coffee,
Right.
chilling out, nice quiet space together, which is what we do now.
Yeah.
We were arguing and
Uh,
we were just like, something's got to give here. And
mm,
so,
yeah.
one of the things that we were talking about was, what are some options that we can do to make this model a little bit more forgiving, or
Yeah.
bring our spouses with us or bring our family with us and turn some of this trip
Yeah.
into some downtime. And
Right.
he would say, yeah, 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 I'll think about it, I'll work on it, and then it wouldn't happen. And
Mm,
so enough of that
yeah.
lid. And I'm really not kidding because he was an exceptional man. It had nothing to do with him not being a good leader. He just
Okay.
couldn't see. And
It was just one of those
sometimes
blind
when
spots then for him, huh? Wow.
yeah, and when we get a blind spot, any of us,
Mm,
when we get a blind spot, other people can see them real clear and we
yeah.
can't.
Right.
And then when someone
Right.
wants to point out our blind spot, we're like, I don't, that's not true. And it's
Yeah.
like,
Defensive.
yeah, it
Yeah.
is.
Right.
So I
Right.
ultimately ended up, what I share this story when I travel and I'm talking with people. I ended up firing my boss
I
because
love
I
it.
really
Yeah.
didn't quit my job because I
Right.
loved the job that I was doing and I loved what I was doing. But what I also realized is selling the proprietary sales system for me, David, was a distraction.
Mm,
Because as I started to recognize that leadership was really what was missing, and
mm-hmm,
I started really looking at what kind of programs can I implement and offer that are leadership based, I
mm-hmm.
started realizing that that really was my sweet spot.
Yeah, I
I
love that.
started getting really passionate about that. And I realized that somebody else's sales system, which was wonderful, and I learned a lot. I learned how to go sell my own programs as a result of his sales system.
Yeah, nice.
But it was a distraction for me because it was watering down what I'm truly made for and what I'm truly
Mm,
meant for. Because I have a real passion for leading leaders. There's
yeah,
something in the space of that that just, I love when people are already operating at really high capacity and
yeah,
getting in there and as a team starting to think into something and helping a really high performing team perform higher.
perform better. Yeah,
I am energized by that.
I love
That
that.
really excites me, and that's
Yeah,
so that's when I made the pivot.
I love that, Trish. And you know, the thing that I get from that story is, so there were three things that were interesting. Well, four things really. Talking about the employee business model, it didn't really like click until you said something about these were all like independent contractors, and so there was really, to me, there was a lack of like buy-in and being, being connected as an employee. But then that buy-in, or lack of buy-in maybe, led to burnout, which was as a result of, lack of boundaries perhaps. And so as we think about those kinds of issues for a leader, I guess, how do you help leaders to be able to create that buy-in in their employees now today? Like, I'm just kind of curious about, like, how do you help employees really get that buy, or employers get that buy-in?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head earlier when you were talking about the fundamentals, because it's
Yeah.
really listening and asking well-placed questions that
Right
really
on.
helps you get the buy-in. Is
Mm,
it's really not about, so I think what happens as leaders, what we do is we go, oh man, I got to go get the buy-in. I have to do this, and I have to go get them to buy into what it is that I want. And what
mm-hmm.
I have noticed, and I'm sure you have as well, is that they really create their own buy-in based
Yeah.
on us being good listeners and good stewards of our people.
Yeah.
When we can see, hear, and value people, they buy in.
Yeah, and I think what happens in those questions, and finding out the kind of what drives and what motivates our people, it is that it's when we ask questions, we then kind of can see what the motivations are and how do we best help those people, and bring out the best in them through those questions and understanding what really got to makes them tick. I love that. I love that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that what I've come to find out over the years is that if we shift away from, and I don't know how to actually say this, David.
Sure.
When we shift away from trying to teach and train leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and we stop kind of like an out of the box training kit,
Yeah.
and we move into what I'm going to call a belonging program.
Oh gosh, you are speaking my language.
When we
Keep
move
going.
into the space of that,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter because, well, first off, I believe each and every one of us is a leader.
Yeah.
And I think we all have a leadership lid, and some lids are lower than others, and some are natural leaders. But I really believe that every single human being is a leader because we
Yeah.
get out of bed in the morning, and the way we get out of bed in the morning and do our day is the way we lead our day.
Yeah.
And from
Yeah.
the
So
time we
good.
wake up until we put our head on our pillow, we have an opportunity to choose to have our
Mm.
day look different than the way we started it, the way we're in the
Yeah.
middle of it, and the way we end it. We
Mm.
always have a choice.
Yeah.
And I just
Right.
really, really, truly believe that when we lean into belonging and we
Mm-hmm.
lean into giving somebody the experience of being seen and heard and valued,
Yeah.
which goes back to your fundamentals, I
Yeah.
really, really, truly believe, like you said, it's like you're speaking my language. And, you know,
Yeah. And I think that as we talk about belonging, one of the things that has to be present is this idea of, and I know you've heard of this, but psychological safety. And the only way we can create that psychological safety is to be able to get people connected sometimes it's in smaller environments, to be able to get, two of our employees together or three of our employees together and then bring them into the larger group. And I think that when we help them to feel comfortable and safe in a smaller environment, they'll feel safe in the larger environment. And to the extent that we can recognize that we all can't do it ourselves, we need each other. Right. I think that's where the shift has to happen. I mean, I know that when I was growing up in the business world, it was truly the hey, I'm a solo contributor. I'm gonna pull myself up by the bootstraps mentality, and that's kind of the way I got taught. But as I've evolved and as I've learned and grown, I mean, we live in a world that's totally different than when I was growing up. And I mean, we didn't have computers. Heck, this wasn't even possible. So no. I think that to the extent that we recognize that we live in a different world, I think that's where the key to unlocking people's potential is this idea of leadership and being able to open up their lid and raise their lid. I love that. I love that. Is there a? Well,
it was a real interesting thought to really. It was a pivot to move from teaching and training to really focusing in the space of belonging and
inviting,
helping people make that shift. And sometimes I think as leaders, we need to make the shift from doing to being.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's a hard shift. I know, though. It's a hard shift, especially because most leaders, many leaders, I won't say many leaders, are hard driving. They're in the words of
doers.
Disc, they're doers. Yeah. They're let's go forward. And that's hard. It's hard to make that shift. So I'm curious, like, how do you help them to make that shift, especially in that's a mindset shift?
Sure. It is a mindset shift. And I think it is something that they have to be willing to make it on their own to begin with. Yeah. I think it's a couple of different ways. I think from a mentoring perspective, it's starting with finding out where they're at. I think it's always starts with meeting somebody where they're at, right?
Right.
And being willing to ask somebody some tough questions sometimes.
Yeah.
And I heard you say something about starting in small groups.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I do with the pivot that I've made and the work that I'm doing now is we work in small groups. And so we'll do the group Zoom space because of geography and everything. And I think COVID was really our friend in our industry. I think COVID was really our friend because so many people are willing to get into that group space. And then there's a lot of people that got burned out from that COVID group space on Zoom, and they're like, never again.
Yeah. I'm
not one of those. I think Zoom is, and all of the different, these kinds of virtual platforms are really good. I think anything, David, that's experiential, where somebody can actually feel something, where they can actually have a sense of, again, I'm going to go back to belonging. If somebody can really get that, if they can see that you see them and that you get what's going on for them. And I may not agree with somebody in what they say. I may not be aligned with it, but instead of disagreeing, I'm more interested in finding out what has them think the way they think. Yeah. And, I think you mentioned it a little bit earlier, is what's getting said and what's not getting said.
Yeah.
And so I sort of think it's in that space.
Yeah. I mean, I think that inviting them just to be able to share their mind and to be in a space to listen generously so that, like you said, they can be heard. That I think is so powerful. And I don't know that there's a lot of leaders that recognize that the power in just allowing someone to be heard. And like you said, that I may not agree, and the decision that I make may still be a decision that I make, but at least if the person that I'm talking with feels like they were able to share what was on their mind, I go back to the buy-in. They're going to buy in, or at least they'll be willing to commit because they've been felt heard, because they've been able to share what's on their mind. I so agree.
You just had me think of a question that I want to ask you.
Yeah, sure.
So when you are working with a group of people and a team of people and you're looking at getting buy-in from everybody, and you
Mm-hmm.
can clearly see that there are one or two people that are, I'll even call them the influencers that you know that if they don't buy in, you're
Right.
going to lose the people that have already bought in when you're done having that session or sessions getting the
Yeah.
buy-in. You can tell
Yeah.
that there's these outliers that have a
Sure.
fair amount of influence.
Yeah.
What do you do? What do
Yeah.
you do to bring them? What do you do to bring them into the mix and get them to buy in? How do you
I
do that?
I love that question. So one of the things I like to do is, because we are visual and we can see people on the screen. It's no different than if they were in the room. You can see body language. You can see when people are, doing a text message, or if they're, trying to, type on their keyboard. I'm gonna call them out. I'm gonna ask a question and say, "Hey, it looks like you may not necessarily agree. Tell me a little bit about what's on your mind. What's your perspective?" I love asking questions, and I'll seriously just call on them to share, because if if they're not buying in, and then they have a perspective maybe that needs to be shared, and I might ask the rest of the group then too, "Hey, does anybody else have this same perspective? Does anybody else feel the same way?" Okay, oh, good. And so we can then kind of go around the Zoom screen, so to speak, and call the elephant in the room.
Right.
I'm the one that likes to be able to be the person who calls out the elephant in the room, and make sure that everybody gets to share their perspective. So I guess to answer your question, that's a long way to answer your question, but it's to ask a good question back to them, and make sure that they are able to communicate what's in their mind.
And open up a really rich dialogue for the people that are
100%.
in the space that might be on the fence. And it would be real easy for
Yes.
those people that are not bought in to bring them off to the fence to the other direction. Have you ever
Yeah.
heard the term? I picked this term up back in the 90s, and it's been a really good one. I don't remember where I learned this term, but have you ever heard aligning in the face of no agreement?
N-
Have you ever
well,
heard
not
that
I
term?
not I don't know that I've heard that term. I think, however, I will go back to something that, like, Patrick Lencioni talks about in The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, where he talks about being able to commit even though I may not necessarily I'm on board. So it's probably the same idea.
Yeah, it's where you really, when you know you've got somebody that literally, adamantly does not buy into what it is you're doing, and they're a key player, that
Mm,
you can actually have a one-on-one conversation with them and say, for the record, I
yeah.
want it to be known for the record that you do not agree with this, that you
Yeah.
absolutely are in full-on disagreement of this. But I'm going
Hmm.
to ask you, would you be willing to align for the sake of the team?
Yeah. Yeah.
Noted, very well noted that you
Hmm.
don't agree, but would you
Mm,
be willing to align and not block progress? And can we
love
count
that.
on you to be able to do that? And we'll do regular check-ins with you to see if any point in
Yeah.
time we maybe, can lean on you to say, hey, you see something from a different perspective than we do. Now we're
Yeah.
into this a little ways. What do you think?
Well, yeah. Right. I love
And then
that.
maybe just get that micro agreement, micro buy-ins from those
Hmm.
people that are not buying in. But I think if you can get somebody to say, yeah, I'll align on behalf of the team, but you just,
Yeah.
as long as you hear me,
You're right.
for
Right.
the record,
I
everybody
think it's
knows
beautiful.
I'm not agreeing on this. Because sometimes
Yeah.
people just need to be heard.
100%. Yeah. I love that you brought that up because I think you're right. Well, I know you're right because when people can be heard and it takes a leader to, in my terminology, speak straight to somebody
Yeah.
who definitely doesn't agree. And it's not about trying to persuade them. It's just about coming to them and say, hey, look, I understand you don't agree. However, like, and so I think that that takes a lot of leadership to do that and to actually, especially for leaders who feel uncomfortable in that space of having a difficult conversation, because
Yeah,
in a lot of ways that's a difficult conversation.
it is. There is no easy way through that conversation, which
Right.
is why so many people don't have them because they're
Yeah,
just not
exactly.
comfortable. They are
Yeah.
really uncomfortable. Yeah.
Right. So how do you in the work that you do, how do you help or how do you see, for example, senior leaders helping their emerging leaders to build, to grow, and to really create almost like a succession plan for their emerging leaders? Because I mean, in my view, the emerging leaders are the next generation of the business, and if it's a solopreneur, or I mean, if it's a solo founder, it's also the perpetuation of the legacy. It's really the protection of the legacy as well. So I'm just kind of curious, how do you help emerging leaders to kind of lift their lid as well?
Sure. Well, I think I tend to, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I tend to move into mentoring mode when I'm in
Sure.
the space of that. And what I mean is to tell a personal story. And so
Yeah.
typically what I work at doing when I'm working with emerging leaders is make sure that I am operating in the space that I'm asking them to operate in. And so what I mean
Hmm.
by that is that I have a mentor, that I have somebody
Yes.
that I am looking to for guidance, and that
Mm.
I'm showing them instead of telling them,
Yeah.
hey, you need to do this, 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 and this. I'm actually saying, hey, I'm I'm a little long in the tooth these days, and it's like I'm still on the path with you. I'm still right alongside you, learning and growing with you. And oh,
Mm-hmm.
by the way, here's what I'm working on, and here's where I'm growing. And I try and
Yeah.
draw on my life experience. For example, if somebody's struggling with accountability and I know they're really struggling with accountability, I'll say
Mm.
something along the lines of, you know what, I have an area of my life that I consider growth and development two different things. And I like to focus on leadership growth, focusing on our strengths and really spending more of the time focusing on our strengths. But I
Mm-hmm.
also think there's
Yeah.
leadership development where we really truly need to focus on the things that we need to get better in that are important to us. There are some things
Mm-hmm.
that I'm not good in that are not important to me.
Yeah.
There are some other things that I'm not very good in, and I'll use this as an example: my health and well being. I'm not great in that area. I'm overweight. I didn't grow up in an environment that I was supported in. So, all of my old programming and all of my old tapes and conditioning
Mm.
don't support living a good, healthy lifestyle.
Mm.
It's just, I've never learned that. And
Sure.
so, real time, and this is real time, David. I just hired somebody to create an accountability program with me, and it's pretty intense.
Oh,
So I
wow.
know I'm dealing with an emerging leader who's struggling with accountability in a different
Yeah.
area. I will go in and tell a story of, I'm
Yeah.
hiring somebody to help me in this area of development that I'm not strong in,
Mm.
and I just did. And this person that I'm
Yeah.
working with, oh my gosh, I take a picture of my food every time I eat anything. I text it to them. I weigh in the morning before I even have any water or anything. I weigh in
Yeah.
and I send that.
Send that.
And I
Oh,
mean, it's
wow.
like, it's like an extreme full on accountability program
Mm.
because I've
Yeah.
tried it on my own, and I've tried it with
Mm.
doing ancillary stuff, or I've tried a nutritionist to see if they could teach
Mm-hmm.
me nutrition. But what I really
Yeah.
need is an accountability partner. What I
Yeah.
really need is somebody to get in there with me in an area where I'm developing and help me get
Mm.
stronger and better.
Gosh, I love that. First of all, kudos to you
Thank you.
take on some area that and share. Thank you for sharing so publicly that
And I'm
area.
scared, by the way.
I'm sure I would be
I have
too.
fear.
Of course, you hit that terror barrier. I
You
get it.
bet.
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. But I think that I think that's really cool about having a mentor and having someone who can help me and you to have that accountability. Sharing that story with an emerging leader also helps them to know that they can reach out for help too. And I really love that, because too many leaders just want their people to just figure it out. Well,
Mhm.
that's not the best way sometimes. They probably can't. Well, I mean, if you have hire smart people, they'll figure it out, but it might take them a little bit of time. Why not help them by telling a story of something that you experienced to be able to help them see it for themselves? And I really love that, and I really think that mentorship piece is really critical.
An
One
extra
of the
piece to that, though. There's an extra piece to it
Yeah,
because
tell me.
if I'm not careful, I run the risk of stealing the spotlight off that person who's having an
Yeah,
accountability issue and making it
sure,
be all about me. So, in
sure.
order for that to really land well, I have to be able to get that said in a really short amount of time and
Yeah.
then move it back over and say, hey, is there anything about that story that you relate to? Is there
Mm-hmm.
anything about that
Mm-hmm.
connected to what you're experiencing right now that kind of transferred? Because not
Yeah,
everybody can transfer a story onto
sure.
themselves and they'll just feel like, oh my God, they just hijacked my time,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So it
Yeah.
really has to be something that is designed intentionally to speak into what it is that, and again, it's still very kind of selfish because it's from my perspective, what I see
Right.
that emerging leader might be experiencing. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna poke around a little bit before I find the story because I need to
Yeah.
figure out what that person's bumping up against. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes mentoring is not the way to go. Sometimes it's coaching.
Coaching, right.
Sometimes it's
Yeah.
just sticking with that well-placed question and
Yep.
keeping in the dialogue of seeing that person and hearing them of where they're at and helping them think through critically think through where they are to where they want to be. And so it's not
Yeah.
always mentoring. So I don't want
Right.
to just say, oh, I just throw a
That's the only
story
way.
there and everything is
Yeah, yeah.
good.
No, I get it. I get it. Yeah. And that, I think that as a leader, that's the real, I'm going to say, difficult part of leadership, is like knowing when is it best, and this is where you really have to know your people. When is it best to mentor? When's it
That's right.
best to coach? And how do we, pick between that? Sometimes that's more of an intuition in my experience.
It is. And then I think it's practice too. I think the
Sure.
more you get
Yeah.
comfortable in the space of like, um, I'll call it being courageously standing in the unknown. That
Yeah.
if we are not going, oh, I know what this is. Oh, I know this emerging leader. Oh, I've seen this before. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is familiar. And it's
Yeah.
like, mm-mm. It's really
Everybody's.
about having the courage to face the unknown. And
Yeah.
then, you had said something earlier, and I kind of want to circle back around to
Sure.
it.
Yeah.
You were talking about a fundamental of listening generously,
Yep.
and it made me think of something again that I'd learned a long time ago, and that is building a space, actually creating space for people.
Hmm.
And so when we listen generously, I think like if you imagine a circle big enough for you to step into, and
Yeah.
then you imagine a circle big enough for two people to step into, and then you imagine a circle that's big enough for a handful of people to step into. The more generous we are in our listening, the bigger the space we are opening
Hmm.
for somebody
Yeah.
else to feel comfortable to speak into that space
Hmm.
that we're listening from. I don't know.
Right.
That's a
Yes.
lot of
Yes.
a weird kind of a weird way to get that said, but I think
Yeah.
it like listening generously really means really creating a really big space for somebody else to be able to show up
Hmm.
and be able to face themselves with courage.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love that. You know, I want to, I know we're kind of bumping up against our time here a little bit, but one last question that I'd like to ask you, because I think that oftentimes the area of, or the topic of leadership can feel like it's nebulous, but I know, you know, that the impact of leadership is enormous on the performance of individuals and ultimately then of the business. And so I'm curious, what do you see as, what is that impact? You know, when somebody says, "Hey, I'm going to invest in leadership development. I'm going to invest in my emerging leaders. I'm going to invest in my executive leadership team." What's the impact to the overall organization when you do that?
Gosh, that's a tough question.
I know that is a tough one. I know.
And and I don't know that I'm going to be able to answer that in the amount of time we have left.
Sure, sure.
But I think what I'm going to do is ask this question of you to see if maybe together we can come up with one or two things.
Yeah,
How do
sure.
you measure the impact?
Mm-hmm.
How do you like what are some metrics?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can measure it,
Yeah. Then you
you
can.
have a much better likelihood of being able to manage whatever that impact is.
Yeah.
And so the
Yeah.
impact is significant and it's mighty. And I think leadership in general, when people practice leadership and leading from where they are, they get a
Mm-hmm.
distinct performance advantage. So I think that's
Yeah.
the impact. How do you
Yeah.
measure it?
Yeah. I think if I was answering that question, one of the things I think about is employee turnover, being able to have a place where people are attracted to, where I'm going to attract A-level talent, not just talent, but A-level talent, high performers. And so I if I'm going to look at some key measurements, I'm going to say, hey, how is my turnover? Has my turnover reduced because of this leadership program? The other thing I think too is just simply people engagement. How much are people engaged in, and again, back to your words too, the buy-in. How are they buying into the vision of this business? Because I know that when there's high engagement scores and low turnover scores, we've got people who are really going to do their very, very best. And so that then translates to how we doing on top line revenues and bottom line revenues. So I kind of think about those four areas just because I think they can translate to a financial impact. I know that if I'm talking to a CEO, a CEO wants to know what's the financial impact of this investment that I'm going to have. And so we can measure that, you know, from the top line, bottom line, and then employee engagement and turnover.
I want to share this with you, and
Yeah,
I don't know if this is okay or not, but I will express this.
100%.
One of my greatest frustrations when
Mm,
I am listening when I am listening for people who are in a leadership program that I would be hosting, and it comes time for them to bring it into their business rather than them just participating individually as a high performing leader.
yeah,
I find that the people that hire me, well, again, I said I'm a leader's leader, so
right.
I'm finding the right people to hire me. But I
Sure.
will express this. One of my greatest frustrations is the leaders who need it the most can't see that they need it and they don't want to
Yeah,
bring it into their business. And
right.
so that is something that I find really, really frustrating. And boy, if we could figure out how to have them hear it and see it in the space of like get that new dawning to
Yeah,
occur,
Yeah, I love that.
That would
Yeah.
just unfrustrate this leader.
Well, and hopefully maybe we get a few of them to listen to this conversation and this podcast, and they can say to themselves, "Hey, maybe there's something more here that I can help,
It sadly shows
grow."
up in, oh, we don't have the budget, or we can't afford it, or we don't,
Yeah,
it's
sure.
not the right time. But what's really happening is there's a deflection and a resistance,
Yeah.
and it's like I need to get better as a leader at bringing those people that can't see that blind spot. I need to be better at asking better questions of
Right.
those leaders that want to complain and say, my team's not accountable, they're lazy, they're this, they're that. And it's like, oh,
Here's a mirror, right? That's the hard part. Yeah,
myself as
exactly.
well, though. I mean, really, it's my
Hey,
mirror too.
well, and that's just it. I think as I mean, we all have blind spots, and so recognizing that that's why I have a coach. That's why I have mentors, is because I want to know where those blind spots are. And if I can become aware of them by someone asking me a good question, gosh,
Mm-hmm.
that's so valuable, because to the extent that I can, get, eyes in the back of my head, I'm going to be a better leader,
That's
and I'm
right.
going to be a better performer as well. So I love that
That's
question
right.
though. And I love that. Yeah. That you brought that
Yeah.
forward. Yeah. That's
I think I'm
awesome.
a lifelong learner anyway. I think I'm constantly interrogating my own reality to look and see how I can grow and get better. And there's always massive opportunity to get better.
Oh, I feel that so deeply. I totally resonate with that, Trish. Trish, is there anything, as we wrap up here today, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you'd love to share with the audience on the topic of leadership, or even just your own personal experience? Open floor, anything you'd like to share?
Really nothing comes to mind. I think we've had a really fun, enjoyable conversation together, David.
Yeah.
Thanks for giving me an opportunity to just kind of just express some thoughts and ideas on leadership in general. Is there anything that comes to mind for you as we wrap up?
Yeah, I love that. So I just think this conversation really, to me, helps to bring forward the topic of leadership and how important it is to the performance of any business. I think, and if we're not developing our leaders, we're going to fall so far behind, because we're not going to be able to hand off to that next generation of leaders when we move on to either another opportunity, or to, retirement, or to, I call it desirement, something else that we want to do.
Love that.
So I think that this really shows that leadership is really important. So I'm so grateful to have you have this conversation, because I want to be able to share that with as many people as we possibly can. So yeah,
Well,
that's my parting thoughts.
nice. Well, thanks for the invitation today. And it's always a pleasure to see you and to talk with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Trish. Thank you for coming on, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.